Hey everybody, Alex Miller at Capnion here. If you're caught up in the polar vortex as I am, I hope you're keeping warm. I'm going to talk about some general observations about how large versus small businesses think about ROI, and then I'm going to unpack some of the consequences as I perceive them for adoption of AI over the next several years. If you hear anything you like in this video, mash some buttons. I recommend the book an appointment button. I'd love to hear from you. So, one thing I've noticed over and over again on my personal journey is that larger businesses tend to prioritize explicit balance sheet costs over implicit ones, and smaller businesses tend to do the opposite. So, on the explicit front, a large business, I've observed that they sometimes do things that look silly, at least to me, because something's in a spreadsheet somewhere as a cost, and then the other side of the story isn't. So let me give a highly theoretical example. Big corporation buys coffee uniformly for all its employees. Some of the coffee is really terrible, cheap coffee. After a while, the reputation of that company around the communities where it has a presence in important talent pools is a lot of joking and gossip about how terrible the coffee is there. Consultants that pass through that office taste the coffee and remember how bad it tastes. From the perspective of someone trying to keep costs under control at corporate headquarters, you could look at, well, what does it cost to have nicer coffee? And it's probably a lot of money. You know, if you go to a nicer brand and it's $5 to $8, that's a lot. If you're buying coffee for tens of thousands of employees, that's an explicit balance sheet cost. But on the other hand, when you're at ground level, maybe you notice that this company is getting a weird, bad, kind of silly reputation as an employer off the backs of this bad coffee. You send some kind of signal with this, and that signal is bad. So it's very plausible to me. Well, you think you're saving money buying cheap coffee, but then you're damaging your reputation in important talent pools, and you're just spending that much more on recruiting, doing things to retain people, and just general lost productivity because you're not sending the right signals to make yourself an appealing place to work. So that's a big company that's explicit balance sheet costs over implicit ones. I would say it tends to be true. A smaller company is much more reacting to all these things they think are happening, but maybe are not reflected on the balance sheet. And to segue to I think it's probably true that the smaller actors of the world are way, way ahead of the bigger ones right now because lots of people you talk to every day have embraced, I found this AI tool. It's like so helpful. I do this with it. I do that with it. I'd like to XYZ. That's a decision about ROI that an individual made. Measuring productivity is really tough, as I'm going to talk more about in a second. When it's just you know your productivity, it's easy to make that decision. It's much harder at a big company where you're looking at investing lots of money in new technology. You maybe have a hope that it's going to improve productivity a lot and it's going to be worth it, but you're paying dollars that are very easy to measure. That's the point of money in a way, for something that's not as easy to measure, and large organizations often balk at that in a way that smaller organizations and individual people don't. So what does this have to do with AI more broadly? We're on an interesting on-ramp, I think. AI in its current hype phase, I would say, differs from some earlier trends in that maybe it's eventually going to go everywhere in the white collar world. All white collar employees have aspects of their job that AI could probably help with. But then I think it's going to be strategically really interesting and important. Well, how fast does it happen that AI gets absolutely everywhere? And then you can think of just specific jobs. And I would say this implicit versus explicit balance sheet thing becomes very important. Realistically, in the beginning, you're going to be enhancing employees with AI and not exactly replacing them. So you go right into the teeth of this problem. Can you measure productivity in a way that justifies whatever the tool is? And sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. So if you've got a customer service job that's about turning over fairly explicit tickets in a satisfactory, well, that's pretty measurable. If you're doing that at a big organization, AI might be coming for you relatively quickly. If you look at something else like software engineering, where I think everybody agrees that new generative AI tools are very promising and improve people's productivity a lot, well, how do you measure the productivity of a software engineer? That's kind of tough. People certainly do things. You could take a naive idea like, well, we're going to count lines of code, and that tells the story well, it tells you something, but then what about quality? Is that really a good idea? These things become toxic pretty quickly sometimes. And then thinking about it from the perspective of a large organization, if you want to invest in a tool to make somebody more productive, well, what's the ROI? Well, can we measure productivity? No, we can't. So to distill this sort of rambling empire of ideas I have here, it's likely that there's going to be areas where smaller companies and individuals are much more ready to make that gamble of, yes, this does make the necessary delta in productivity for what it costs. And large organizations are going to have more trouble making that decision, I would expect.